Tallahassee, Florida, a quiet suburb where life usually flows peacefully and measured. But one day, something happened that shook the entire community. A local university professor was found unconscious in the driveway of his own house, bleeding profusely. This man is Daniel Eric Markel, a father of 2 young boys who had everything to live for. The police found themselves at a dead end. No evidence, no suspects, no DNA, only one unreliable witness. It became clear that this case would not be simple and quick. It would require all the experience and patience of the investigators to solve it. Dan was born in 1972 in Toronto, Canada. He was a smart and successful man. He studied at prestigious universities, including Cambridge, and in 2001, he received a law degree from Harvard. After that, he worked as a clerk at a law firm for several years. In 2005, he got an opportunity he couldn't pass up. The University of Florida's law school was looking for a professor with the same qualifications as Dan. He jumped at this chance and was a perfect fit for his new career at the university. Daniel Markel had all the prerequisites for a happy life and a successful career. But unfortunately, one tragic event crossed out all his plans. On the one hand, Dan loved teaching, and on the other, he was in love with criminal law. Despite his busy schedule teaching various legal disciplines, he found time to write numerous works in the field of criminal law. But please, right now, subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and write any comment to promote this video in YouTube algorithms. But it wasn't just career successes that brought joy to Dan's life. He met his love, Wendi Adelson, on a dating site for single Jews. Despite their age difference, Dan was 33 and Wendi was 26. They were a perfect match for each other. Wendi was also passionate about criminal law and later, just like Dan, started teaching at the University of Florida. Their relationship developed rapidly, and the couple couldn't wait to get married. In a short time, they got to know each other well, got engaged, and finally tied the knot on February 26, 2006. The couple lived an ideal life. They both had their dream jobs, a good income, and in 2009, they welcomed their firstborn, followed by a second son. In 2010, life seemed wonderful, and it continued that way until 2012, when their relationship fell apart and they divorced. It seemed that Dan and Wendi had everything for a happy family life: love, common interests, successful career, children. But sometimes, even in the strongest relationships, at first glance, cracks appear that lead to the destruction of the marriage. The couple carefully concealed all the details of their divorce, so no one knows for sure why their marriage fell apart. In 2013, they officially divorced, and the image they presented to the public did not reflect the real situation in their family at all. Once, Dan went on a business trip, and when he returned home, he was shocked by what he saw. The house was almost completely emptied out. Wendi left only a few things, including a mattress. It took her just a day, while Dan was away, to move everything out of the house. Usually, moving out of a house is a stressful process that requires careful planning. But judging by how far Wendi went in emptying their shared home, she had been thinking about it long before. This indicates the deplorable state their marriage was in. And as if that wasn't enough, Wendi left Dan another gift on the mattress: a stack of divorce papers. The divorce process was very difficult, and Wendi had plenty of reasons to be angry. Obviously, she did everything possible to cause Dan as much suffering as possible during this process. Divorce is always a painful process, especially when the couple cannot agree amicably. But such outright hostility and a desire to hurt a former partner is an alarming sign. Wendi went even further in her desire to erase Dan from her life and the lives of their children. She changed the children's last name to her maiden name, and even changed the name of one of her sons, which was given in honor of Dan's deceased relative. Friends, a very important point: creating such content requires a lot of time, and currently, my channel and I are going through a difficult financial situation. I would be immensely grateful if you become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. In return, I will be able to personally respond to you in the comments and also mention your noble name in my video. So become sponsors, and I will be eternally grateful to you. The divorce was not easy for Wendi, and she made every effort to erase any mention of Dan. It's one thing when a couple realizes that they can no longer be together, but it's another thing entirely when children are involved. They will still have to maintain contact. Attempts to isolate children from one of the parents look like cruel revenge. In 2014, Dan and Wendi lived separately. Wendi took up writing and wrote a book about human trafficking based on her experience. But it seems that her approach to writing was different from Dan's. and the book turned out to be a complete failure. Critics described it as terribly bad, so it was hardly worth rushing to the bookstore for this masterpiece. On July 18, 2014, Dan, as usual, was heading to Wendi's house to pick up the children and take them to kindergarten. This was part of his usual daily routine. In divorce situations, one of the parties often starts behaving irrationally, driven by emotions, but it's important to remember that children should not become hostages of adult conflicts. They have the right to communicate with both parents, regardless of how the relationship between the former spouses turned out. That morning, Dan followed his usual routine. He went to the gym, stopped by a few stores, nothing unusual. But soon everything was about to change dramatically. Around 11 o'clock, Dan finished his business and returned home. As he was approaching his house, he noticed that someone was already waiting for him there. At that moment, Dan was talking to someone on the phone. This interlocutor later told the police about their conversation and what he managed to hear and understand. According to him, whoever the person waiting for Dan was, they had obviously set up an ambush. There was no dialogue between them. Only a loud bang rang out before Dan even had time to open the car door. The bullet flew through the driver's side window and hit Dan right in the face. The impact was so strong that his head was thrown back against the headrest. One of the neighbors accidentally heard the shot and saw a gruesome picture. Dan was sitting motionless behind the wheel, surrounded by broken glass, with the interior and windshield covered in blood. Without wasting a second, the neighbor called 911. In such situations, it is very important for eyewitnesses to immediately call the emergency services. Every minute can be decisive in saving a life, and although the neighbor acted absolutely correctly, unfortunately, it is not always possible to get comprehensive information from witnesses in a state of shock. The neighbor said that he saw a car pull into the driveway and then heard a shot. Looking out the window, he saw Dan in critical condition in the front seat of the car. The man was still alive but could not call for help. The neighbor also noted that he could not say with certainty whether it was a suicide attempt or if someone had shot Dan. But in any case, the victim needed immediate help. While the ambulance was on its way, the police tried to get all possible information from the neighbor. However, the only thing he could report was that he saw a silver Toyota Prius leaving the scene immediately after the shot. Of course, the police should have followed up on this lead, but it is quite possible that it was just a random car passing by. The medics arrived 19 minutes later and urgently transported Dan to the nearest hospital. Unfortunately, an unfortunate mistake occurred. The dispatcher who took the call from the neighbor did not convey the information about the victim's critical condition. That's why it took the ambulance so long to get to the scene. And with a gunshot wound to the face, every minute counts. Sometimes the smallest mistake or oversight can cost a person their life, especially when it comes to such serious injuries as a gunshot wound to the head. It's a pity that valuable time was wasted due to a lack of communication between the services. We will never know for sure whether the delay in the ambulance's arrival affected the tragic outcome, but the fact remains, Dan could not survive the injuries he sustained. He fought for his life in the intensive care unit for 14 hours, but unfortunately, his heart stopped. Now the police were faced with an incredibly difficult task. A man who seemingly had no enemies and was loved by many was ruthlessly shot dead on the doorstep of his own home. And the only lead was a mysterious silver Toyota Prius that might have been involved in the crime, or might have had nothing to do with it at all. Shortly after the tragedy, a memorial service was held in Dan's memory. That day, many people gathered. Friends, relatives, students, all those who wanted to express their love, respect, and gratitude to the talented professor. The police were at a crossroads. Without evidence or suspects, they needed to decide where to start the investigation. The first person to fall under suspicion was Dan's ex-wife, Wendi Adelson. She was called to the police station on the day of her husband's murder. Wendi was not arrested, but for the police, it was a starting point. Before the interrogation, the woman listened to a voice message from a friend who worked as a realtor. Often in investigations of this kind, the victim's closest people become the first suspects. And although this is not always fair, you have to start somewhere. Any little thing can be the key to solving the crime. In the voice message, the friend said, "Hey Wendi, I feel a little awkward telling you this, and I don't want to dramatize the situation, but there was a shooting today near your former house. I hope you're okay, my dear." It went on to say how sorry the friend was that Wendi had to find out about it this way. But the fact remains, there was a shooting near her former residence. The ex-husband was critically wounded and was unlikely to survive. Upon hearing this, Wendi became extremely upset and burst into tears. She said that she had been emailing Dan that morning and everything was fine. Then the woman asked the investigators what happened to her ex-husband. The police officer replied that he could not disclose any details until he found out where she was at the time of the shooting. This is a standard procedure to exclude her from the list of suspects. Wendi responded very emotionally, but at the same time, somewhat detached. She reported that she had only left the house at noon on some business. She even wanted to drive past her former street, but saw that it was blocked off. The behavior of suspects during the first interrogation can tell an experienced investigator a lot. Unnatural emotionality, excessive detachment, unnecessary detailing of their actions, all this may indicate a desire to hide something. However, people react differently to stress, so it is too early to draw final conclusions. When the police asked Wendi if she knew anyone who might wish Dan harm, she just continued to cry bitterly. Finally, she replied that although Dan sometimes didn't treat people in the best way, she couldn't imagine anyone daring to be so cruel to him. The investigator inquired whether Dan owed anyone money. Through tears, Wendi replied that in fact, it was her ex-husband who owed her money child support. Wendi seemed genuinely shocked by the tragedy. She was almost going crazy with grief. The officer conducting the interrogation treated her very carefully and sympathetically. The problem for the police was that they still had no solid leads. The robbery version seemed unlikely since the attacker did not try to enter Dan's house, did not search for valuables in his car or pockets. At that moment, the investigators had only one possible motive: revenge. But why would someone want to take revenge on Dan? Could Wendi be right in assuming that he might have offended someone or done something improper? It's one thing to annoy a person, but it's quite another to drive someone to the point where they would pull out a gun in broad daylight and shoot you in cold blood. In murder investigations, it is very important to correctly identify the motive for the crime. This helps narrow down the list of suspects and understand in which direction to move further. However, sometimes we are faced with situations where there is no rational motive, and then you have to dig deeper, look for non-obvious connections and hidden conflicts. In search of at least some leads, the police decided to appeal to the public. They made it clear this was a deliberate murder, and they announced an immediate reward for those who provide information that would help arrest and convict the criminals. The reward amount started at $10,000, but later increased to $25,000. Some time after the sworn testimony was made public, it turned out that, according to the investigators, the suspect Garcia had an accomplice, 33-year-old Luis Rivera. It was assumed that this couple left Miami on July 16, 17 in a rented silver Toyota Prius and moved around Florida. The police gathered snippets of information about these two: cell phone data, electronic records, video footage from surveillance cameras from various buildings and buses in the area. The video, it was believed, captured a couple who were following Dan Markel on July 18 as he went about his daily business, driving from kindergarten to the gym, then to the store and home. But why did these two suddenly become suspects? And why did they decide to kill a man with whom they seemingly had never crossed paths before? The police suspected that it was a contract killing. Someone paid Garcia and Rivera to kill Dan Markel. And most interestingly, this information came from a secret informant whose identity was never revealed. Thus, the key question remains unanswered. If it really was a contract murder, then who was the customer? It seems that the time has come to shed light on this mystery. Contract killings are perhaps the most difficult to investigate. After all, the real criminal hides behind the backs of the direct perpetrators. Finding a connection between the killer and the customer, proving their collusion, that's the real challenge for investigators. Especially if you have to work with anonymous informants whose motives are not always clear. No matter how much Garcia and Rivera were paid for their work, it turned out to be not enough for them to take all the blame. As soon as they realized that the game was over, they immediately began to sing like canaries during police interrogations. They told investigators that they were hired by none other than Charlie and Donna Adelson, the brother and mother of Dan's ex-wife. At first glance, these two were respectable members of society who together ran the Adelson Dental Clinic and Institute. By the way, I apologize if I mispronounced their last name. Charlie was a dentist, and Donna was in charge of patient care. It's hard to believe, but these testimonies alone were not enough to bring Charlie and Donna to justice. After all, as far as the police knew, the murder suspects could name any names in a desperate attempt to save their own skin. And what connection could there be between a respected family doctor, the owner of a dental clinic, and two hit men from Miami? Strangely, it took a long time to unravel this tangle. In the end, the missing link turned out to be a woman named Katherine Magbanua. She not only had an affair with Charlie Adelson, but also had a previous relationship with Sigfredo Garcia, from whom she had 2 children. Phone records showed that almost immediately after Dan Markel's murder, Katherine received a call from Rivera, probably to report that the order had been carried out. Katherine was the only connecting link between all the participants in the conspiracy. Rivera, Garcia, and Adelson claimed that they had never met each other in person before. For her services as an intermediary, Katherine received $100,000. After analyzing Magbanua's bank account, it was established that over 12 months, she made deposits amounting to tens of thousands of dollars. Often, the key to solving high-profile murders lies in seemingly insignificant details and minor figures. It is important not only to focus on the main suspects, but also to carefully track all their connections and contacts. After all, that's where you can find the missing puzzles that will make up the complete picture of the crime. These suspicious transactions on Katherine's account began a few months before Dan Markel's murder and continued for several months after the crime. Isn't this the height of recklessness? Interestingly, the payments were almost always made in the form of checks. Not the smartest move on the part of the Adelson family, don't you think? After all, checks are very easy to track for one simple reason: they always have a signature. And every such check deposited into Magbanua's account was signed by none other than Donna Adelson. Hatred is perhaps too strong a word, but in this case, it fits best. Donna Adelson openly hated her former son-in-law, especially in the months leading up to his murder. She bombarded Dan with emails, one after another, cursing him, insulting him, using her entire arsenal of swear words. In one particularly telling message, she wrote that Wendi had suffered too long being married to Dan. His narcissism had destroyed their marriage, so now it was time to strike at the most painful spot. The entire Adelson family lived in Miami, but Wendi settled separately in Tallahassee, near her ex-husband. She wanted to return to Miami to be closer to her family, but Dan was against it. Since Markel did not resort to threats or violence, he went to court and obtained a ban on Wendi moving with the children. The fact is that during the divorce, they agreed on equal custody of their sons. But there was another reason for the mother-in-law's dislike of Dan. Shortly before his murder, he again went to court with a petition that did not allow Donna Adelson to spend time alone with his children without his supervision. Of course, this in no way justifies Donna's actions because, as we know, the attempt on Dan's life was planned long before this petition was filed. As you can see, at first glance, everything seems quite obvious, doesn't it? An angry mother-in-law, an offended ex-wife. Motive is always a key element in murder investigations, and although family conflicts often cause violence, one should not jump to hasty conclusions. Sometimes, deeper reasons and darker secrets are hidden behind outward simplicity. The task of a detective is to remain impartial and check all versions, even if they seem obvious. The offense went too far, but one should not jump to conclusions. Rivera nearly ruined the entire case. While in jail without the right to bail on other charges, Lewis asked for a meeting with investigators. He stated that he had information that he was ready to exchange for a deal with the investigation. The detectives readily agreed to re-interrogate Rivera, and this is where Lewis gave his version of events. According to him, he did not know that a murder was being planned until he got into the car with Garcia. He was allegedly told that it would be an ordinary robbery, and when he found out about the murder of Dan Markel, he was extremely dissatisfied. He said he only wanted to rob the woman who was supposed to pay for it. Rivera and Garcia were promised $35,000 each for the job, but Lewis insisted that he was not going to kill a man, especially a father of many children, with whom he was not previously acquainted and against whom he had nothing. Rivera claimed that he had never even heard this man's name before and had not seen him until Garcia showed him a photo. As for the Adelsons, Lewis allegedly did not know about them at all, but only referred to a woman named Katie, that is, Katherine. It was she, according to Rivera, who was the main person in this case, and he also mentioned that some woman wanted to get her children back and gain full custody of them. Up to this point, the Adelsons still denied any involvement in the murder, despite the fact that the police had checks signed by Donna. However, this does not yet prove her intention to kill Dan. The checks could have been written for many reasons. But at this moment, the FBI joined the case. They developed a special operation to catch this family. Charlie Adelson began to receive strange calls from an unknown number. The caller was a woman who introduced herself as Sandy. She asked why Rivera, while in prison, was not worried about what was happening, and why his family was not helping him on the outside. Charlie was clearly frightened by these calls, but he kept his composure long enough not to give himself away. Sandy, of course, was an undercover agent, and the FBI was tapping Charlie's phone, hoping to hear something that could be used against him. But for now, this attempt failed. In July 2016, a grand jury in Leon County charged Garcia and Rivera with first-degree murder. Katherine Magbanua was arrested a little later. Rivera, who was already serving a sentence for other crimes, managed to have the charges reduced to second-degree murder, obviously for cooperating with the investigation and pleading guilty. He was sentenced to 12 years for unrelated crimes plus 19 years for complicity in the murder of Dan Markel. The trials of Katherine Magbanua and Sigfredo Garcia were combined into one, which took place on October 19, 2016, since the charges against them were identical. The prosecution claimed that Charlie Adelson was the mastermind behind this whole dirty business. Allegedly, he promised $100,000 for Dan's murder so that his sister could gain sole custody of the children after the death of her ex-husband. At the trial, the prosecutor called an interesting witness, Jeffrey Lacasse, who, as it turned out, had once dated Wendi Adelson. Lacasse confirmed that he had heard from Wendi about how her brother Charlie had repeatedly discussed the possibility of hiring a killer to murder Dan. According to Jeffrey, on July 13, Wendi asked if she could entrust him with something confidential. Eventually, she said that Charlie had considered all possible options for solving her problem and talked about hiring a hitman. Wendi told Lacasse that getting rid of Professor Markel would cost about $50,000. At the trial, Sigfredo Garcia insisted that the fatal shot was fired by his partner Luis Rivera. But the problem is that Rivera claimed just the opposite. However, this was hardly enough to remove the first-degree murder charge from Garcia. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus another 30 years for conspiracy. Garcia stated that he would appeal the verdict. As for Katherine, she categorically denied any involvement in the murder. At the same trial as Garcia, her charges were reduced to second-degree murder. But after 11 days of deliberation, the jury could not reach an agreement, so the judge was forced to declare a mistrial and order a new trial. Often during high-profile trials, unexpected twists occur. Attempts by the accused to shift the blame onto each other, the appearance of new witnesses, conflicting testimonies, all this can significantly affect the course of the case. The task of the investigation and the prosecution is to carefully check each fact and not succumb to manipulation. Only in this way can a fair verdict be achieved. Katherine Magbanua was released on bail pending a new trial. It took over 6 years for Katie to finally face trial. The retrial began on May 16, 2022, and lasted 11 days. This time, the jury was more decisive. On May 27, 2022, Katherine Magbanua was found guilty of first-degree murder and solicitation to commit murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years for participation in a criminal conspiracy and another 30 for solicitation. So even if Katie theoretically gets out of prison someday on a life sentence, she will still have to serve an additional 60 years behind bars. It is clear that the jurors were shocked by the details of this case. Many believe that two key figures, Wendi and Donna, were unfairly left at large, because of whom, most likely, everything happened. After all, it was they who planned and wished for Dan Markel's death. Well, we can only hope that justice will eventually catch up with them too. It is worth noting that this case and the verdicts handed down caused quite a stir in society. Opinions were divided. Some consider the punishment too lenient, while others consider it too severe. In conclusion, I want to say that Dan Markel certainly did not deserve such a terrible death. In the prime of his life, at 41, he could have done and achieved so much more. Colleagues and students remember him as a brilliant scientist and educator, the author of numerous works in the field of jurisprudence. And relatives and friends remember him as a sensitive son, brother, and friend. But above all, Dan loved his children. They were the meaning of his life. Perhaps that is why he so resolutely defended his parental rights in court, so that his little ones would never be separated from their father. Unfortunately, Dan was not destined to see his boys grow up. They will forever remember him as young and full of energy, and all because of the treachery of two people whose names Dan didn't even know and whom he had never seen in his life. Such a sad and senseless story. Well, thank you for your attention. With this, our episode comes to an end. I hope this investigation has once again reminded us all of the fragility of human life and how important it is to cherish every moment spent with loved ones. Take care of yourself and see you next time on the air. Unfortunately, even the harshest sentences cannot bring back the lives of crime victims and heal the wounds of their loved ones. Murder is always a tragedy that destroys the lives of many people, and our duty as law enforcement officers is to do everything possible to punish the guilty and prevent such crimes in the future. Let this story be a warning to those who believe that revenge and violence can be justified. This is the wrong path that leads only to suffering and loss.